All right. So I'm Mikkel Reher-Langberg, and I'm here with Jonathan Entis from the US. We're here on behalf of the Malmö Center for ISTDP, because Jonathan, you're doing a seminar over here in Malmö, in Scandinavia, in Malmö, in April. It's is it April 20th and 21st?
That's right. Yeah, I'm really excited about it.
Yeah. So Thomas Heslow, a mutual friend of ours, is organizing this event, and he invited us to do this, have this little interview, this little talk about you and your work as a kind of a introduction to the course, or promotion for the course. So of course we're happy to do that. We know each other, Jonathan and I. We know each other from actually from a Davanloo study group some years back, and we're working on a book together right now, and gotten to know each other over the years. So of course I'm really happy to help people get to know you and your work.
Thanks. Yeah, well, I consider you a close friend now too. So yeah.
So this is nice. Jonathan, I thought about how to go about this, and how to best kind of get into your approach to ISTDP and your work as it is relevant to the seminar that you're doing. And I think I would not be the only one who would have the word Davanloo come up as one of the first ones when thinking about you and your work. So I thought we'd have to have discussion here about your take on Davanloo, and hopefully that will shed some light on your style, your take on the work. I mean, first of all, you are, at this point, I wouldn't be exaggerating if I said that you're very well known as one of the most prominent students of Davanloo's published cases in our generation of therapists. What they think they call it the fourth generation ISTDP therapist at this point. So you know these cases, I think, better than anyone of us. The first question I want to get into is what caused you to dive into Davanloo's cases with this kind of enthusiasm, and over such a long period of time. I mean, you've gone over these cases again and again and again and again.
Yeah, somewhat obsessively, some might say.
Exactly. Why did you do that? Why did you want to do that?
So, well, that really had to myself, exactly, other than my own masochism. Well, so that story starts with when I began training in ISTDP. So I started a core training with Patricia Coughlin, who's brilliant, and been also, along with Davanloo and John Rathhauser and, other people that I've trained with and seen, has been enormous influence on me. But at the time that I started training with her, I really didn't know anything about ISTDP. I'd been a patient many years before for a relatively brief treatment, but it had blown me away and been so impactful in my life. But I didn't at the time understand really what was happening in the treatment. I mean, I didn't know the technique really. So I started training with Patricia, but I was also reading other books and things that I could find, like John Fredrickson's book, which was great. And so when we first started talking in some of the early blocks, and I presented about some work that I thought, was in keeping with what I'd been reading in one of these books, and having discussion and kind of spouting ideas that came from these books, Patricia was very open in saying, well, she disagreed with these ideas. And it wasn't that I necessarily misunderstood what I'd read, but that she viewed it differently, and that kind of her ISTDP was different than what I was reading in this book, and that was a surprise to me, because I was naive and I didn't know that there were different strains or styles of ISTDP. So that was kind of my first exposure to this idea that there's different ways of doing ISTDP. Mm-hmm. And then one of the things that I'm eternally grateful to Patricia is she supplied all of us, the core trainees, with many of Davanloo's writings and really encouraged us to dive as deeply as possible in them. Mm-hmm. So when I first started doing that, I mean, I was really blown away because what I was reading was now different than everything was different than, you know, I'd seen her work and other people's work, and it felt very unique and kind of sui generis. And, you know, as I was reading it, I didn't understand a lot of what I was reading in terms of the technique or exactly why he would do what he would do, but it spoke to me. There was something about it, and I don't know that I can really describe it better than that. It was an emotional connection I got to the work. And it felt different for me than you know, the other work I had seen or read. And because I didn't understand it, it was like a puzzle. And I like puzzles. You know, I've always liked puzzles, and it bugs me when I don't understand something. So what I started to do is I said, this looks to me like I'm getting a bird's eye view of a city, but I just see it from the top. I see the tops of the buildings. I don't see what the buildings look like from down there. I don't see the architecture of the buildings in this city. So I started obsessively reading it. Pretty soon I realized that the commentary in the articles was mostly worthless. Some of it was okay, but a lot of his articles aren't even written by him. And what they say, you know, they'll intersperse the transcript with commentary. And once you know enough, you realize, well, that doesn't really make sense. That's not really what's happening there. So I stopped even reading the commentary and just focused extensively and solely on the transcripts themselves. And over time, I started being able to understand the architecture of what he was doing. And when I couldn't, I would start doing kind of basically like comp lit stuff where I would, you know, compare one case to another case. These seem similar. Why is it different? And it'd be like poring over it and trying to understand it. So it became an obsession, but one that really enhanced my own work, because once I started understanding the system, why he was doing what he was doing, I adopted that for myself. And then I felt like I really understood the work on a very deep level. So that's kind of a preliminary answer.
Was there has there been like a development in that? Was there anything that spoke to you in the beginning and then that you've become more fond of with time? Or I know that my understanding is that Patricia's emphasis is on the very early texts by Davanloo. Am I right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, she shared them all, but she herself has talked about, she especially appreciates the ones from the very late 70s, kind of mid to late 70s, seem to be her favorite, maybe into early 80s. Yeah, that's a good point. So, right, so she had us read those cases, which are brilliant cases. I mean, you can't argue with them. But for me, those actually weren't the ones that hit home. The ones that hit home for me are the ones that I believe hit home for you too, which are these cases from the early mid 80s to mid 90s, something like that. I mean, as you've spoken about, who knows when he actually did the cases, right? When they're published.
Published, of course.
So there's a system there, and it's different. It's an evolution of the system from the late 70s, which feels more tied to psychoanalysis. It's kind of somewhere in between, and different than the mobilization or even the direction he took ISTDP in the late 90s, early 2000s, as exemplified by the case of the man with crushing chest pain, which feels kind of somewhere in between ISTDP and mobilization. So prior to that and after the works in the late 70s.
Nice.
But to your question, is there something that changed over time or yeah, I mean, so I remember when I first read it, although it spoke to me, at first I read it, and you know, you can't infer tone also when you read something. And I read it, I was like, oh geez, this guy seems harsh, you know, and so I was like, oh wow, it's being really blunt. And now I read it, I'll read the same thing, and it reads totally different. And I'm thinking, wow, he's being so generous to kind of put himself out there and just be so direct, not waste any time. Like, you know, time is of the essence. Let's get to it. I transitioned from feeling like there was something more negative to feeling actually is more positive there. So that's just kind of one of the changes. I hear a different voice in my head when I read it now.
But don't you think that that's often the case when you get to know ISTDP better? You get to appreciate the complexity of the empathy that lies in the work, even though it's quite confrontative.
Absolutely.
Interesting how that gets projected onto the voice in the text, right?
Exactly. Of course, that was my projection to think, oh, this is harsh, right? It was stirring up my own feelings and anxiety and resistance and all that. So yeah, and I think that's true of the different authors and for sure. But yeah, I just have a different level of appreciation, and because I understand it better now than when I first started reading, I'm reading for different things, different nuances, and then I think I'm also more comfortable to say, oh, I would have done it differently, or like, I like that he did that, but I would have done something different, rather than kind of saying, oh, this is the way, so I'm able to kind of disagree with him now.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Can you maybe, I'm wondering, what was it that what have you found to, if you were to say something about that, what have you found that you feel characterizes the style of ISTDP that you find in the transcripts? And now this is the part of the whole return to Davanloo discussion, that also this also the headline for much of what Thomas does at the Center for ISTDP in Malmö, that there's the stylistic differences between therapists, and it seems that you found something that you found to be unique in the work that is in these transcripts, even though we know that the transcripts are edited and we don't have the whole case and we don't know exactly when they're published. There seems to be something unique anyway in these the way that Davanloo works in the transcripts that we have available. What is it you found to characterize this that style that sets it apart from other, like the garden variety ISTDP that we
Right, or some other trends maybe within the community.
Right.
Yeah, I think there's a lot. And honestly, we could probably talk for hours pulling out all the differences. So just some, kind of the biggest one I think that speaks to me, and then maybe we could talk about a few others, is the manner in which he manages and deals with resistance. So of course, all ISTDP styles deal with resistance, okay? And they all address resistance. But there's a very particular kind of relationship and position he takes vis-a-vis the resistance, in my estimation. By the way, I want to, again, clarify, I'm really talking about that period, that kind of mid-'80s to late '90s period. Yeah, also it's not a value judgment on doing it another way, but just what I see in this particular kind of 10 to 15 year period.
At least the publications from that period, right? So the ones
Exactly.
in the two books, basically.
Exactly. All the articles that were compiled into the two books. Is a very unique relationship with the resistance, where he's not just resisting it, or rather he's not just addressing it, but but that's actually, it's the opposite. He's not resisting it, he's bringing it out, and he's very specifically trying to enhance it. He's trying to get every aspect out and crystallized in between the therapist and the patient. So really bring out to the maximum capacity the transference component of the resistance. But I want to say a little bit more about what I mean. Mm-hmm. So, he might call attention to someone, looking away, and then the person says something like, they were tuning him out, let's just say, okay? He doesn't then just say, kind of, well, what do you feel that makes you want to tune me out, which would be a perfectly acceptable intervention. Nor does he just do, a head-on collision. Well, if you tune me out, what's going to happen here? Also would be perfectly acceptable. But more times than not, what he's going to do is put pressure on the defense. He's going to say, so tell me about this part of you that comes here asking for help, but then looks away and tunes me out. What's that about? So he's putting some pressure on the person to stay with the defense, to talk about it, to examine it. At times, one of the trends that I see in both trainees that I work with who've been trained in by different trainers, or videos you see on the conferences and things, at times it can feel like ISTDP has this propulsive force towards a goal, and the goal seems to be getting to feelings. Okay, that's one of the trends that I see. And, that could be very helpful and therapeutic, but it's different than what he's doing. He's slowing the process down. He's actually sitting with the person, trying to hold their feet to the fire, to look at their resistance. And it's really, I think, out of this deep belief that what really changes character, what really gets people's will fully on board, what really changes people on a very deep kind of structural level is not just about feelings, but it's about their engagement and understanding of their resistance. So he draws that out and puts a lot of pressure there that I think is very different than what I see in some other styles.
Mm-hmm. So, the easy answer to that would be, well, that depends on the case, whether you can do that.
Mm-hmm.
Depends on the nature of the resistance. It depends on the psychodiagnosis.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And there's some truth to that. But what I'm seeing is even within the same types of cases or the same types of psychodiagnoses, it's not just an issue of, well, that was with a highly resistant case and, we're talking about fragile cases. No, we're even within the same criteria, it's just a different way of being. And I want to point out, there's many roads that lead to Rome. Okay, so I think ISTDP is a big tent now, and there's many different styles, and that's wonderful. And there's also many innovations that Davanloo just didn't get a chance to make, that some of the second generation people have made, or third generation, and I'm sure will continue to be made. And that's all well and good. But his particular style that he developed, especially within that period, you don't see that, I think, rarely in the community, that type of engagement with the resistance, that holding the person. And, the other thing is, I don't want to speculate too much about why, but there's also a certain level of energy and charge to doing that. Because when you're doing that, the transference component of the resistance is high. The tension between the therapist and the patient is high. You're kind of walking that knife's edge when you're really examining the aspects of the resistance that are coming between the therapist and the patient. So it does take a lot of kind of gumption and grit to stay there and say, let's not get to your feelings. You're clearly, there's a major part of you that doesn't want to get to your feelings. So
Yeah.
let's look at the fact that you're sitting here with me, and a major part of you says, no, you don't want to look at it. What's that about? Right? Rather than saying, okay, if you don't do that, then how do you feel towards me? Which it can work, but it's the energy and supply is coming from the therapist, and it's just a different thing.
So basically what you're saying is that there is no one ISTDP. There is no one right ISTDP, that there are many different approaches to ISTDP. There is not in one situation one thing that would be the right thing to do. You can go about it in several different ways. You can choose depending on your personal development or your predilections or whatever, which approach you would apply in a given situation.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, what I've heard from John Rathhauser, who's been a mentor to both of us, is, Davanloo even said, you can take the same patient and the trial therapy can go very well in many different ways. There's not just kind of one way for it to unfold. So even within one kind of style, there's many different decisions and things that can, change the course of it. But certainly, yes, amongst the styles too, and they're all ISTDP, and I think that's great. And I think you had made a comment at some point about, as a community, we should get beyond any discussion of true or false ISTDP or right or wrong. And I agree with you. It's all ISTDP and it's all good, but it's worthwhile having discussions about differences, and my interest in that came, from a few issues. One is, when I was first starting out, just difficulties in trying to make sense of things with the jargon, the way people speak all being the same. And then it became harder for me to integrate. I worked my way through it. But then I'm hearing from my trainees who train with a lot of different people. They say, well, I don't get it because, you're saying this and that person's saying that and that person's saying this. And it's true. What I've heard when I've mentioned that, kind of to the community, people have said, well, look, really, don't listen to anyone, just listen to the patient, response to intervention. That's true. But even aside from that, there are certain, kind of rules and guidelines that we follow when we're learning a technique. And if we all use the same language for different things, it makes it harder to integrate. So I'm happy about the differences. And I think that's a wonderful thing about the community. And I think we need to get better at being able to talk about it.
So I mean, my take on your take on this is that whenever someone becomes so meticulous in their interest in something that you are with ISTDP, what happens naturally is they start to appreciate nuances, right? And this happens whether it's someone who is very fond of football or cars or I don't know, whatever. They start to appreciate the stylistic differences between this football team and that football team, whereas someone who would come in from the outside would say, well, isn't it just the same? They're just kicking this ball around, So I find that this grows out of your love for the field, So that's
absolutely. And it's true. I mean, it all comes from a place of love and passion for this field and this community and what we're doing. And yeah, I mean, I think again, just to give you credit, I think you've mentioned that some of these differences that we're talking about, we could almost classify them as aesthetic differences, right? And some of that is true. And I want to give you credit because I like that term. And so, but yeah, there's room for all of it, but so this is the style of ISTDP that I fell in love with. And I'm still in love with, and that, and so to me, I get excited talking about it and thinking about it. And then, the reason I say that what I do is DISTDP or Davanloo's ISTDP, well, I don't really get credit for that. John Rathhauser, I think, invented that. And, I copied it from him, having trained with him, so extensively. But I think it's just to get out of that the problematic of having trainees come to us and say, well, I don't get it. You're doing this and that person's doing that. I say, okay, well, this is the language I have, but at least I'll put it under a heading so people can see, I'm really trying to emulate something from that very particular period. So they have a context for it.
So to sum up, I mean, just to go back to what you said about Davanloo, would it be fair to say that what we find in the transcripts is a way of working or propelling the process forward on the basis of the resistance itself, each step at a time, that there's a way of working where by identifying each manifestation of the resistance and diving into it, so putting pressure into it, so deepening the process through one manifestation of the resistance, it will then evolve into a new manifestation, and then you deepen the process into that, and then it evolves into a new manifestation. So it's a very organic evolution of the process through a constant focus on the resistance.
That's beautifully put, better than I put it. And what I'd say is, there's a few things that makes me think of. One is that's right. So what I hear from trainees very often is, they see the resistance just as an impediment to getting to the feelings. But actually, the way you just put it is really beautiful. Actually, no, this is the good stuff too. We want to be looking at this too. Let's deepen this. It's not about just like, oh, when are we going to get to feelings? It's let's deepen, and look at all aspects of the resistance. And then once we've done it and we've seen it from all sides, like you say, organically it morphs, it shifts, other aspects of the resistance come out. And I think that's part of, Davanloo's also very broad-based understanding of the unconscious, where it's not just about feelings. Feelings are important, of course, but the resistance is a massive part of the unconscious too. And, as you know, resistance is, range from fully conscious to fully unconscious and then somewhere in between.
Mhm.
So, looking at that aspect of the unconscious is something that's worthwhile to just kind of sit on and look at, and then organically it shifts. Yeah, so I would agree with that. The other thing I want to say about that makes me think of is, and that's another thing that I think is unique to Davanloo, is that there's a way the cases flow. It doesn't feel like a technique. It doesn't feel mechanistic. It's like he's never more than one step ahead of the patient. It feels like he's not driving the process, but rather it's really collaborative. He's listening to all aspects of the patient. He's interested. It's not like he's like, feeling, did I hear about feeling? He's listening to all aspects of it, and he's interested in so much of it. And then when you almost think of it, some of this I think of like, I've been writing for our book, and I've been thinking a lot about like transitional sentences, the sentence, the beginning of one paragraph, to make sure it connects with the last paragraph. So he's great at that. Okay. He's great at transitions. If he asks a question, it doesn't feel like it comes out of nowhere. It doesn't feel like it's like some roadmap he has here that's divorced from what's happening. Everything the patient is able to follow, because it came from what the patient last said. And he just does that in a way where he's kind of building a case. He's building a story with the patient based on what they're saying. And it flows organically, like you say.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, maybe that's also something that we should be talking more about, is that the way he orients himself in the process is more, it seems, akin to traditional psychodynamic psychotherapy or psychoanalytic psychotherapy even. He has to, like people who are trained in psychoanalytic psychotherapy, he has a good psychodynamic intuition, and he knows how to listen for the unconscious and see patterns and so on and so forth. And that's what allows him to move towards the unconscious in an empathetic way and in a meaningful way every step of the process, right?
I completely agree. Very, very dynamic. And then you see that it's a great point, because it reminds me, you see that in the beginning in this way that it is dynamic, right? But also after. So what you see is, you don't hear a lot of people talk about what happens after the unlocking or in the working through phase. Now, also some of his cases don't have as much of that as I'd like, but the ones that do, I mean, it's beautiful. And you see that he really is in keeping with this idea that the experience of the complex transference feelings is the unlocking mechanism, but it's not the be-all end-all conflict. And you see this in the working through phase. You see this when he's doing dynamic exploration of the past, analysis of the transference. He's looking at all kinds of conflicts. Just as an example, the case of the fragile woman, who's not actually fragile, but he calls her that because the previous evaluator had thought she was fragile. He's looking at all kinds of sexual conflicts that she's having. You don't hear people talk so much about that anymore. Patricia talks a lot about that, but other than that, it's just not commonly talked about. Similarly, in the case of the strangler, really a very intense passage is when he's working with this man on how, when he's having sexual relations with his wife, actually he's fantasizing about his daughter, who's the only one he's able to be close with. Okay, and this is a conflict. It's not a conflict about guilt over murderous rage, but it is a dynamic conflict. And it comes from Davanloo's deep understanding of psychodynamics. So that kind of thing too, it's just broader based than I think some of the meta-psychology that's taught, and fairly, that he even talked about. I think he really heavily focused on his unique contributions, and then didn't talk as much about what he was actually doing, which was broader than that.
Yeah, and also, the whole dogmatism about guilt that he introduced in the late years, early on, it seems to have been more inclusive to painful feelings, to the pain of traumatization, and not necessarily guilt. I mean, so we could, people could say that this is just, he emphasizes one part, and of course we take the other for granted. But there's something in the way that we talk about metapsychology, and that what is emphasized in in the work that actually affects how it's how we transmit it and understand it. So that's important.
I think that's true. And I think, you know, and about how it's talked about, how it's taught, you know, so right. I mean, early on, he was much more focused on grief and grief-based feelings. And then, you know, even in the transcripts, you see, you know, the majority of the cases in his first book, or well, not his first book, but the first book within this period, you know, Unlocking the Unconscious. Almost all of those cases, the breakthrough that happens is a partial unlocking breakthrough into grief. And he really emphasized that and how important that was. And it does seem later that got lost, where a heavier focus on guilt and rage. But yeah, I mean, getting to grief-based feelings for some people don't have murderous rage and guilt about it. And getting to grief and pain is where it's at in order to help them. But these are the nuances that, you know, are in his work. And I think, you know, take a lot of time to study and understand, and might not be in all strains of ISTDP. I don't know.
So I'm wondering, my impression is that our generation, now I'm lumping our generation of therapists together, is there is an increasing interest in Davanloo, and there's an increasing interest in studying the articles, understanding where ISTP comes from. Also, my impression is that up until a couple of years ago, many of my colleagues hadn't, you know, you read like one article or two articles and then largely put it aside. But now it's coming back in a sense. There seems to be this it's kind of in the air that people are seeing something there in the articles there. Why do you think that is at this point? What do you think it is that people are looking for there?
I think it's a complex answer. So I mean, you know, I don't know. I can tell you some of my thoughts about it. You know, I think like me, you know, people noticed that there are differences amongst the different trainers, and they said, okay, well, people are doing it differently. They all seem to get great results, so that's all wonderful. But why are they doing it differently? And what are these differences? And so I think a lot of people want to go back to Davanloo to understand the fundamentals of the method and understand what's innovative, what's progressive, what's changed, what hasn't. So I think there's a natural inclination to go there to understand the variations in what they're seeing presented. I think that's one aspect of it. You know, another aspect of it, I think, is because of the nature of how he engages with the resistance, like we talked about. I think people are well aware when they read those articles, it looks different. And some people really like that style, and some people don't. But the people who do, I think they see something that's of interest and of value, and they want to learn it more. You know, I also think if you look at any kind of school or field or movement, there's always going to be people who are interested in innovation and what, you know, might be called progress and change, and always people who are looking back to the origins and the fundamentals, kind of originalists. And those are just kind of two natural strains that come with any movement. And so I think we're seeing that now. It's been kind of enough years out, especially with people in our generation who never met Davanloo. And didn't work with him directly. And so we don't have that kind of personalized relationship, for better or worse. And, you know, all we have is the work. And so we want to go back to it and see what's there, you know, that might help us.
I have two thoughts. Maybe you could reflect on them, reflect back to me what you think about it. One is that it's interesting. It reminds me of what you said earlier, that when you first read Davanloo, it seemed kind of rough around the edges, you know, and you projected like quite a harsh tone into it. I recall kind of having pretty much the same reaction. I know that many of my colleagues, you know, when we read Davanloo 10 years ago, had the same reactions. But then today, 10 years down the road or more, when they read him now, it's a completely different thing. Like when you've developed an appreciation for the work, it opens up, and suddenly there's something very subtle and rewarding there. So maybe it just takes some maturation for the most of us who have our own personal process to go through in order to integrate the work. Like we have to mature in order to then become able to appreciate the style of these cases. What do you think about that?
I agree. Yeah. Oh, I totally think you're right. And I think, you know, it definitely was some element of projection when I was reading it, or if you, you know, were reading and had that reaction. And, you know, but something within us made us go back to it. We, you know, because we could have had the reaction, oh, this is too harsh, you know, goodbye. And I'm not interested in that. But there was some kernel of something in it that made us, you know, drawn to that work. And, you know, we knew that there was something we weren't getting. And, you know, I think that was our awareness that there was a maturation, to use your word, that we needed to kind of go through to see it in a light where we could integrate it and make use of it. So I totally, agree with that. Absolutely.
Also, I think that another thing you mentioned is that you've come to a point where you can allow yourself to disagree with Davanloo, something that has been illegal for many years. But don't you think that that's also part of it? That when you get to it first, like I think that it how to put it, like in psychoanalysis, Freud is not only the father of psychoanalysis, he's also a father figure in psychoanalysis. And that means that in order to find your own, you know, to stand on your own two legs, or what you say, you have to take a stand with respect to that figure. You know, you need to find your position with respect to the father figure. Like there's no way around it. If you want to be a person of your own, you need to have that kind of confrontation with the origins, right? And early on, it's kind of it's fraught with neurosis, right? Either you become like, oh, this is too far away, I could never live up to this, or you say, oh, this is the only way to do it, or there is compliance and defiance, all. But then when you get into it, you can really, I think, use Davanloo as a way of developing your own style of ISTDP, paradoxically, by returning to the most authoritative voice ever in the ISTDP community. At least,
for sure.
I speak for many in my generation of ISTDP therapists that is actually a way of finding one's own voice in sort of in a dialogue with that original voice, in a sense. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. Oh, I think it's brilliant. I mean, you know, and there's layers to it though, right? Because I mean, okay, so for sure, he's the most authoritative because he was the founder. It's complex for people in our generation because we didn't have that personal relationship, but we did have personal relationships with other people who have been in authoritative positions with us, right? Other trainers. So it's like we have, I mean, it's intergenerational, you know? So is he like the patriarch, like the grandfather patriarch for us? I mean, there's all kind of aspects to it. But yeah, I totally agree with you that to find our own identity, we're working out our relationship to the people who came before us and who we learned from. And we don't want to be blindly or slavishly following what they did, but nor do we want to just say everything they did was wrong and I'm going to do something different, right? You've got to find what works for you, integrating what feels like the best of them, you know, with whatever's the best of you. You know, that's going to look different for different people.
Right. So I think it's really interesting why this interest in studying Davanloo is sort of rising up at this point in the evolution of ISTDP. I'm still trying to figure out what exactly is going on. Is it just a coincidence because there are some people who are very enthusiastic about it, or is there actually something emerging from the community?
What do you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I'm interviewing you, you know.
Yeah, but well, it could be a little bit of a conversation too. I mean, if you want to, give a little your 2 cents.
Oh, I don't know, Jonathan. I think for me, there's an interesting evolution in the positioning of Davanloo with respect to new cohorts of therapists. Originally, he was the authority. Like Davanloo was the authority figure. You had to sort of adapt to him. Like what he says, or you're out. Like there's a very it's a very tangible authority figure there.
Yeah.
In my generation, he's been completely absent. The absent grandfather. He wasn't there. I never knew him. He was this. He did all this stuff and then he disappeared. Finding Davanloo is kind of a neutral place in a sense. It's going back to something that feels like an original form of ISTDP, but no one has forced it upon you. It's not something that you have to be accountable for. You can play with it in a different way, paradoxically.
Right. And
also, I think that for me, when I got into ISTDP, it was through John Fredrickson, through his book, and that was kind of the Bible for me when I started. Like as for everyone, as for most other people of my generation. And then I think that what happens is that when you've developed for many years and that style, and then that's kind of the perspective that you've kind of gotten to know ISTDP through. Then when you look at Davanloo, there are some things that stand out there, and then you get attracted to those through the contrast, through the stylistic contrast, and then that feels appealing, because you want to develop, you want to develop and explore areas of the technique that you don't quite understand, that just like you said in the beginning of our talk today. So it's a process that's going on for many people. At least for me, but I think I'm not the only one who...
There's another thing that I was thinking of just as you were saying that too, which is, I think, when I think about what elements of the work were hardest for me to integrate, and then I think about the different styles, what I saw in Davanloo's work was the hardest of the hard. That the things that made the work difficult and activating, for my unconscious and, for me emotionally and intellectually, it's like that was the extreme. And it's not from a blind idealization of him as a person. I'm just talking about reading the transcripts and being like, whoa, and it goes to that initial reaction of, oh, that's harsh, right? This is one and the same of what I'm talking about, that, staying there with the resistance, especially with the transference component of the resistance, is, in my opinion, the hardest thing for therapists. Sometimes people say, oh, well, the hardest thing for us, what we get activated, is the patient's feelings. I actually don't think so, because I think that's what people are wanting, what therapists want. They want to get to the feelings. And so once you get to the feelings, it's like a generous gift that the patient is giving to you and sharing. I think what's most activating for therapists is the transference component of the resistance, because that's where you're most likely to potentially get caught in some sort of enactment where, they're going to be pulling for something from you. They're, in a sense, rejecting you. They're putting up a wall and they're not letting you in. And Davanloo's whole technique is to maximize that whole thing and to speak directly to it and to get down in the trenches with the patient and be there with them, and not to try to go quickly through it, but to really sit there. So everything that makes that process exciting and difficult is maximized in that work. And so that was another thing that drew me, is that challenge, that excitement of trying to master that. And I think a lot of people see it similarly.
So this is this makes me think, you know, I think it was Thomas actually said, he described your style as very balanced between being warm but also being very confrontative. You know, leaning heavily on the use of head-on collisions for clarifying purposes, for challenging purposes, even for pressure. You know, leaning heavily on that prevention, and that takes some. It takes some development to be able to take that position as a therapist. I mean, what was it like for you? Did it come naturally, or did it take what did it take for you on a personal level?
Yeah. It's a great question. Well, it was a journey, and you know, in the beginning, you know, before I'd ever done a head-on class, I was anxious, you know, and also in the beginning, the early days, when I'd be doing it kind of well, and the transference component of the resistance was rising, I'd also get anxious at times because, like, oh, I'm getting angry, they were rejecting me, and then, you know, like, this is. And so I had to work on that extensively. You know, that doesn't, you know, for the most part happen now. Occasionally it does, but nothing like what it did. And so that was a personal journey also of kind of overcoming, you know, my own obstacles. Yeah, and so, but also, you know, I don't want to bog it down with technical stuff because it's a personal and emotional question, but just to add the technical piece, some of those interventions just feel different to me now. You know, so many people think the head-on collision is like the ultimate, you know, like, oh, I can do everything, but I'm struggling to do a head-on collision. And, you know, for me, that was like that originally, but now I feel that actually head-on collisions are much easier for me to get into than kind of outright challenge. So he, you know, as you know, and you know as much about this as I do, but, you know, he classified head-on collision as the ultimate form of challenge, but that's an area I disagree with. I think it's really its own thing. There's elements of challenge, there's elements of pressure, there's elements of clarification. But I think that by and large, patients respond really well to head-on collision, and it is clarifying and for them and structuring. So those interventions don't activate me anymore in the way they used to, because I see them differently. But yeah, you know, I think I do lean very heavily on confrontation, and I don't claim it's an innovation. I really see that as being as much as possible in keeping with what I've, you know, seen in Davanloo and from, you know, John Rathhauser, my mentor too. Yeah.
So maybe just to kind of approach the end of our interview here, maybe could you say something about your presentation in Malmö? What will you be focusing on there? It says I believe that the title is working effectively with resistance.
Yeah.
You could also just have called it ISTDP course.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm not a great marketer and I'm not great at PR or branding. I mean, as you can see, I basically said I haven't innovated anything. I mean, I just consider myself a good craftsman and trying to do, you know, what other people have created.
There's something specific about the way that you want to teach working with the resistance, right? There's something, what you're focusing on is, I guess that this is what you're going to be doing, because this is what I know you to do. You'll be focusing on how you handle resistance.
Yeah.
And maybe you could say something about what you hope to add to people's development as ISTDP therapists with your take on working with resistance in this course.
Yeah.
What do you hope to convey there, or to?
Yeah, so, you know, I'm going to be showing 3 cases, you know, and I'm working out the fine details of which ones and all, but, you know, 3 very different cases. But what they'll all have in common is this heavy focus on the resistance in you know, the style of that, you know, kind of Davanloo, golden era Davanloo, as you might call it, as much as I can. You know, look, for all, I'm no spokesman for Davanloo. For all I know, he'd see my work and he'd say, ugh. So, but, you know, it's my impression or my you know, best attempt to emulate that style. You know, I don't think anyone's going to walk away from a one-day presentation and know how to do the work so differently. But what I hope is that it gets them questioning. You know, I hope it gets people pondering, this seems interesting. This is a different way that maybe I should, or I could start approaching resistance. Maybe, you know, I am focusing too much on feelings or rushing the process of restructuring. So I would hope people would start to question their engagement with resistance. I don't know that they'll come away with answers, but I hope they have some more questions for themselves.
Brilliant. Yeah.
Thanks.
I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you very much. I am too. And this was a pleasure. Thank you so much for doing this with me.
Likewise, Jonathan. Likewise.
All right. Okay. Bye, Mikkel.
Bye.